In August 1876, 38 glass boxes left London carrying seedlings that could break an entire continent's grip on rubber. Each box had glass sides and a glass roof. Inside stood a miniature landscape of soil, leaves, water and air. Outside waited a sea voyage from Britain to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The seedlings were descendants of seeds gathered in Brazil, and their survival mattered far beyond any garden. Rubber was becoming an essential industrial material. If these fragile plants reached Asia alive, Britain could begin moving production away from the Amazon. Roughly 90% survived. The technology that protected them had no engine, no moving parts and no grand laboratory pedigree. It began with a moth jar in a smoky London neighborhood. The accident in a bottle. Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward was a physician in London's East End and an enthusiastic amateur naturalist. He wanted to grow ferns, but early 19th century London was hostile to delicate greenery. Coal smoke and sulphurous air settled over the city. Ward later wrote that he had once maintained a collection of about 1,500 plants, but pollution defeated many of his efforts. In 1829, while examining the life cycle of a sphinx moth, he placed a pupa in a wide-mouthed glass bottle with damp earth and decaying leaves. Then something unintended happened. A fern and a blade of grass germinated inside. The surprise was not merely that they sprouted. They kept growing. Moisture evaporated from the soil and leaves, condensed on the cooler glass, and fell back into the earth. Sunlight entered, while London's sod largely stayed out. The bottle contained a crude, self-watering environment. Ward observed the plants for years. His fern eventually produced spores. In an age when a ship might spend months between ports and fresh water was rationed for people, a plant that carried its own tiny rain cycle suggested an extraordinary possibility. Ward developed the bottle into a practical glazed chest. Designs varied, but a typical traveling case had a sturdy wooden base, close-fitting glass panels and protective battens. It could stand on deck, where plants received light, while its enclosure shielded them from salt spray, drying wind and careless watering. The case was not always perfectly airtight, despite the shorthand often used today. Later versions included controlled ventilation. Its real genius was that it reduced the daily attention a living cargo required. A plant no longer had to depend on a sailor remembering exactly when and how much to water it. A voyage that changed the odds. In 1833, Ward arranged a public test. 2 cases filled with ferns, mosses and grasses sailed from London to Sydney. After months at sea, the plants arrived alive. Australian plants were then packed into the same cases for the return journey. They too survived. Ward published his findings in 1842 in a book titled On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. Gardeners noticed, but so did institutions interested in something more consequential than ferns. Before Ward's box, transporting living plants over oceans was a gamble. Specimens were often stored below deck, where they lacked light, or exposed above deck, where salt and wind damaged them. Watering could kill through excess as easily as neglect. Seeds were more compact, but many lost viability, and a seed did not always reproduce a prized cultivated variety. A living cutting or seedling carried more certainty. The Wardian case did not make every voyage succeed. It changed the odds enough to make systematic transfer possible. Kew became one of the great switching stations in this new network. Joseph Dalton Hooker used glazed cases to send plants home from his travels in the early 1840s. By 1847, Kew was using the boxes frequently, often packing dozens of plants in each. A garden on the Thames could now receive living material from one colony, study and propagate it, then dispatch descendants to another. The case turned a botanic garden from a collection into a logistics hub. There was a domestic afterlife too. Smaller ornamental versions appeared in Victorian drawing rooms, where people grew ferns beneath glass. The modern terrarium descends from this fashion. But the traveling chest had the larger historical shadow. It gave empires a practical instrument for separating valuable plants from the places and communities that had long controlled their cultivation. Tea leaves the Chinese hills. Consider tea. By the 19th century, British consumers drank immense quantities imported from China. British officials wanted a supply within territories they controlled. Tea was already growing in Assam, where indigenous communities including the Singpho had long known and used the plant. Colonial experiments began there in the 1830s. So it would be wrong to say that a Scottish plant hunter simply brought tea to an empty Indian landscape. What Robert Fortune helped transfer from China was particular plant material, manufacturing knowledge, and experienced workers for an expanding imperial industry. The East India Company sent Fortune into China in 1848. Foreign access to the interior was restricted. Fortune traveled in Chinese dress, collected in celebrated tea districts, and learned how leaves were processed. His first shipments exposed the old transport problem: delicate material could perish before it even began the main voyage. Wardian cases offered a solution. Tea seeds could be sown in the soil inside them. During the journey, they might germinate into seedlings already adapted to their enclosed nursery. Contemporary and later accounts differ over how best to count Fortune's cargo. Plants, seedlings, and seeds are sometimes collapsed into one dramatic number, but the scale was in the tens of thousands. The reliable point is not a perfect tally. It is that Ward's technology enabled large consignments of living Chinese tea material to reach India during Fortune's 1848 to 1851 mission. Chinese specialists and tools traveled too. The cases carried biology, people carried knowledge. Together they helped British planters cultivate Chinese varieties in Himalayan districts and refine an Indian tea industry that also relied heavily on Assam tea. This transfer is often told as a clever botanical heist. It was also an imperial project built on restricted access, commercial espionage, and coercive plantation labor. The glass box was morally neutral in the narrow mechanical sense, but its use was not. It weakened the connection between a valuable crop and the region that had developed expertise around it. A cup of British-style tea could increasingly be filled from British-ruled land. The change reached beyond fields and warehouses. British taxation and taste had already made tea an everyday habit, but dependence on China created a persistent trade imbalance. Silver flowed east to pay for Chinese goods. The East India Company's opium exports from India to China were one brutal attempt to reverse that flow, helping produce the conflicts that opened treaty ports to foreign merchants. Fortune entered China after the First Opium War, inside the unequal political order it created. His cases therefore belong to the same history as gunboats, even though they look like garden furniture. They offered a quieter way to alter commercial power: do not merely negotiate for the finished product, move the productive organism itself. Nor did the plant travel alone in any meaningful sense. Knowing when to pluck, roll, heat, and dry tea leaves could not be sealed into a glass chest. Fortune recruited Chinese tea makers and obtained equipment. Indian workers then supplied the labor on plantations operating under harsh colonial systems. The box was powerful because it fitted into institutions capable of moving knowledge, money, and people around it. This is what makes it a small hinge rather than a lone heroic invention. A hinge does not build the door or decide where it leads. It makes a movement possible that the larger structure is waiting to perform. Rubber crosses the world. 3 decades later, the same logic reached rubber. Hevea brasiliensis, the para rubber tree, was native to the Amazon basin. Demand rose after vulcanization made rubber more stable and useful, and later bicycles and motorcars would make it strategic. In 1876, Henry Wickham shipped roughly 70,000 rubber seeds from Brazil to Kew. Calling this episode theft or smuggling is common, though the precise legal and political circumstances remain debated. What is certain is that the seeds arrived in London and Kew planted them quickly because rubber seeds lose viability fast. Only a fraction germinated. That is exactly where the Wardian case re-entered the story. The Brazilian seeds had crossed the Atlantic as seeds, not as flourishing trees under glass. Kew raised the survivors into seedlings. On August 9, according to a contemporary report, 1,919 plants were dispatched in 38 Wardian cases toward the Botanic Garden at Paradinia in Ceylon. About 90% reached their destination in excellent condition. Some rubber plants later moved through colonial botanical networks to Singapore and Malaya. Cultivation, selection, and improved tapping methods took years. The box was not a magic plantation. It was the bridge that allowed living stock to cross the most vulnerable stage of the transfer. By the early 20th century, Southeast Asian plantations were overturning the Amazon's place in the rubber trade. That transformation involved governments, gardens, scientists, planters, capital, and exploited labor. Yet all of them depended on a biological fact: a rubber tree had to be alive in the new soil before anyone could improve or multiply it. 38 glazed chests helped deliver that starting point. The same basic technology also moved cinchona, whose bark yielded quinine, as well as bananas, ornamental flowers, and countless other plants. Landscapes that seemed locally rooted were being assembled through global transport. The box inside the modern world. The Wardian case remained in queues service for nearly a century. Improvements in shipping and then air transport reduced its importance. Quarantine rules also grew stricter as governments recognized the danger of moving pests and diseases with living plants. Q records using a Wardian case as late as 1962 for ornamental plants sent from Fiji. By then, the device had helped create the very global botanical traffic that modern quarantine systems had to police. Its legacy is easy to miss because the object looks so modest. It resembles a cold frame, a terrarium, or a piece of Victorian furniture. But look at what it changed. Before it, oceans often reinforced the geography of useful plants. Tea knowledge and tea varieties clustered in Asian regions where they had been cultivated. Rubber belonged ecologically to the Amazon. After reliable plant cases joined steamships and imperial gardens, those geographies became more editable. Officials could treat a species almost like a transferable machine, acquire it, protect it, copy it, and install it elsewhere. That is the surprising connection hidden in Ward's moth bottle. The fern that appeared in polluted London did more than inspire the terrarium on a modern windowsill. Its closed loop of condensation became infrastructure for open-ended empire. A tabletop ecosystem helped detach commodities from their homelands. The next time tea steams beside a rubber-soled shoe, remember that both supply chains pass through versions of the same small glass box, and that part of the modern global economy began when a doctor neglected to open a jar.